On July 20, 2025, U.S. President Donald Trump announced a framework tax agreement with Vietnam on Truth Social, marking a turning point in Washington's strategy to reshape the global supply chain. Trump declared, "I have reached a trade agreement with Vietnam, opening their market to U.S. goods with 0% tax, while Vietnamese goods exported to the U.S. are subject to a 20% tax, and transit goods are subject to a 40% tax. This is a big win for America." The agreement, signed after a phone call between Trump and General Secretary To Lam, imposes a 20% tax on made-in-Vietnam goods exported to the U.S., much lower than the 46% rate in the original Liberation Day plan, and 40% on transit goods, mainly targeting products from China re-exported through Vietnam to avoid U.S. taxes. The agreement not only facilitates Vietnamese goods to access the U.S. market, but also affirms Vietnam's role as an alternative manufacturing hub in the electronics, textiles, and automobile industries. According to the United States Trade Representative, Vietnam's exports to the U.S. will reach $136.6 billion in 2024, an increase of approximately 19.3% over the previous year. The United States currently has a trade deficit of $123.5 billion with Vietnam. According to the Vietnamese Ministry of Industry and Trade, this agreement could boost exports by 10–15% in the next 3 years, especially in areas such as electronics, accounting for 40% of exports to the U.S., and textiles. In return, Vietnam commits to opening its market to U.S. goods, especially large import tax, with a 0% import tax while tightening control over the origin of goods to prevent tax evasion. Reuters Breaking Views also analyzed that the U.S. will impose a 40% tax on goods suspected of transiting from China through Vietnam in order to prevent tax evasion by labeling them as made in Vietnam at low prices. This is part of a new tax agreement between the U.S. and Vietnam aimed at ensuring a transparent supply chain and protecting the U.S. market from trade fraud. This agreement sends a clear signal. The U.S. is stepping up its friendshoring strategy, prioritizing allies and strategic partners like Vietnam to reduce its dependence on China, a country that is subject to cumulative tariffs of up to 245% on some goods. Corporations such as Nike, Apple, and Samsung, which have shifted production to Vietnam, 20% of iPad production and 90% of Apple accessories are assembled here, will benefit from preferential tariffs, strengthening Vietnam's position in the global supply chain. The agreement is considered to bring immediate benefits to Vietnam. The 20% tariff helps maintain the competitiveness of Vietnamese goods in the U.S. market, especially in the context of competitors such as Cambodia, 49%, and Thailand, 46%, facing higher tariffs. The stocks of Vietnamese exporters, especially in the textile and electronics industries, may grow slightly thanks to positive market sentiment. However, the 40% tariff on transit goods forces Vietnam to invest heavily in its origin control system, increasing short-term operating costs. For the U.S., the agreement not only reduces the trade deficit, $2,023.5 billion in trade deficit with Vietnam in the year 2024, but also promotes exports of goods, especially automobiles and agricultural products, to Vietnam. Wall Street reacted positively immediately after the deal was reached, with the S&P 500 rising 0.47% and the Nasdaq rising 0.94% on July 2, 2025, hitting record highs thanks to the growth of technology stocks such as Nvidia, Apple, Alphabet, and Tesla, up 5%, despite a decline in second quarter sales, as the data was better than analysts' gloomy forecasts. According to Reuters, news of the U.S.-Vietnam trade deal eased concerns about a prolonged trade war, contributing to the optimism in the market. However, risks still exist. The Trump administration has hinted at an upcoming deal with India, but warned that other countries may not be ready by the July 9, 2025 deadline. Stephen Schoenfeld, CEO of Market Vector Indexes, identified,
if the administration does not extend the July 9th deadline and we don't have a slew of trade agreements between now and then, I think the market will become very nervous very quickly. If the administration, as I believe they might, does extend the deadline, it will be a sigh of relief, but I don't necessarily believe it will be a sharp rally because we still have to wait for these trade agreements to be codified.
According to Bloomberg Economics, the deal could cost Vietnam 25% of its exports to the US in the medium term, equivalent to 2% of GDP if it fails to effectively control transit goods. Furthermore, the cost of living in the US could rise due to inflation from tariffs, with Goldman Sachs forecasting the risk of a US recession rising from 20% to 35% in the next 12 months. According to Xinhua news agency, at the regular press conference held by the Ministry of Commerce on July 3rd, Ministry of Commerce spokesperson He Yongqin answered reporters' questions regarding the trade agreement reached between the United States and Vietnam. She stated that China has taken note of the relevant situation and is conducting an assessment.
美国对全球贸易伙伴加征所谓对等关税是典型的单边霸凌做法，中方一直坚决反对。中方注意到相关情况，正在开展评估。中方的立场是一贯的，我们乐见各方通过平等磋商解决与美方经贸分歧，但坚决反对任何一方以牺牲中方利益为手段达成交易。如果出现这样情况，中方将坚决予以反制，维护自身正当权益。
The reasons for this strong reaction may lie in three main factors, as follows. China is concerned about losing its position in the global supply chain, which China, once the world's factory, is under pressure from the trade war with the US, the US-Vietnam agreement, especially the 40% tax on transit goods, disrupting China's tax evasion strategy through Vietnam and other ASEAN countries. About 90% of garment factories in Vietnam and Cambodia are operated by Chinese enterprises, and tightening origin control could cause these factories to lose their competitive advantage, pushing production back to China or to other countries with higher costs. The next concern is probably the decline in regional economic influence. China is Vietnam's largest trading partner, with imports from China reaching 30 billion USD in the first quarter of 2025, accounting for 40% of Vietnam's total imports. And finally, there are domestic pressures and a crisis of confidence. China's economy is facing slowing growth, 4.8% in 2024, according to the World Bank, and a lingering real estate crisis. The US-Vietnamtax agreement brings significant economic opportunities to Vietnam, strengthening its position as a golden link in the global supply chain. Export growth. The preferential tax rate of 20% helps Vietnamese goods, especially electronics and textiles, maintain their competitive vitality in the US market. With export turnover to the US reaching $136.6 billion in 2024, corporations such as Samsung and Nike will expand investment, providing FDI tilde 38 billion USD, up more than 9% compared to 2023, attracting FDI and shifting supply chains. The agreement strengthens the US's friend strategy, making Vietnam a priority destination for multinational corporations. High-tech industries such as chip manufacturing and advanced semiconductors. This helps Vietnam increase added value in chain applications, reducing dependence on pure processing. Expanding the US import market. The commitment to reduce import tariffs to 0% for large Visa engine cars and US agricultural products creates opportunities for Vietnam to access high-quality technology and goods, while improving vehicle trade relations, reducing the US trade wound $123.5 billion in 2024. However, this opportunity comes with serious formulas requiring Vietnam to act quickly and decisively. In the context of Vietnam taking advantage of the opportunity from the new tax agreement with the US, controlling the origin of goods becomes a decisive factor. The 40% tax rate on transit goods, mainly pearls, to products from China remanufactured through Vietnam, Hanoi forces must invest heavily in the traceability system and supply chain transparency. In parallel with the requirement for origin transparency, Vietnam's logistics infrastructure and production capacity are also under a lot of pressure. At Siem Reap, the deepest in the south, cargo throughput has surpassed 5.6 million TEUs per year. Data from Tradelinks found that the average processing time is now only 14 to 17 hours, still considered an efficient result in the region, but there are signs of overload during peak hours. lasting nearly a day. Not only that, the power grid system, especially in the industrial zones of the north, is also entering a challenging period. Vietnam Electricity, EVN, forecasts that the total system capacity in 2025 can reach 54,510 megawatts. However, with electricity demand increasing by 12 to 13% in the summer, the risk of temporary shortages is certainly still present, requiring coordination and investment in renewable energy. All of these factors, from origin controls to infrastructure and energy, are shaping Vietnam's future as a golden link in the global supply chain. Relying on raw materials from China is also a rough recipe for Vietnam's base products. In the first quarter of 2025, imports from China reached about 30 billion US dollars, especially in areas such as electronic components, machinery, and steel. This dependence makes Vietnam vulnerable to export controls or price adjustments from Beijing, especially in the context of rising global trade tensions. At the same time, Vietnam is also facing increasingly fierce competition in the region. Indonesia, with a population of more than 270 million and a world of rich resources, attracted up to 55.3 billion US dollars in FDI in 2024, surpassing Vietnam and emerging as the most attractive investment destination in Southeast Asia. In addition, meeting international standards is becoming increasingly urgent. Multinational corporations, especially from the West, are increasingly paying attention to ESG factors, environment, society, and governance in the application chain. However, Vietnam is still facing barriers. According to Transparency International's 2024 Corruption Perceptions Index, Vietnam scored 40 out of 100, ranking 88th out of 180 countries, showing that there is still much room for improvement to build investor confidence. Faced with intertwined opportunities and pressures, diversifying supply sources, reforming and improving production standards will be the key for Vietnam to maintain its competitive advantage and rise up the global value chain. The US-Vietnam tariff agreement, accompanied by Trump's emphatic declaration of a great victory for America, reinforces Vietnam's position as a golden link in the global supply chain, while helping the US reduce its dependence on China. Wall Street investors reacted positively to this news, reflecting expectations for a more stable supply chain. However, Vietnam faces challenges in managing rules of origin, improving infrastructure, reducing reliance on China, and regional competition, while also needing to skillfully balance relations between the US and China to avoid geopolitical and economic risks. Can Vietnam seize the opportunity while mitigating these risks? The answer lies in today's strategic steps.